Cop slapped Senator John Kennedy. Seconds later, he flipped the whole scenario. That was a headline burning across every news outlet, social media feed, and late-night talk show. A story so unbelievable, so outrageous, that people at first thought it was satire. But it wasn't. It was real, or at least as real as anyone could handle. Picture this. A courthouse in the heart of Washington, packed with reporters, cameras, and citizens who had shown up just to witness another routine hearing. Senator John Kennedy, the Louisiana lawmaker known for his sharp wit, slow Southern drawl, and no-nonsense attitude, had been called in to oversee a heated case involving police accountability. Nobody expected fireworks that day. Everyone thought it would be another long session of legal jargon, political grandstanding, and yawns from the back row. But then it happened. A minor disagreement escalated into a heated exchange between Kennedy and a pair of officers brought in as witnesses. One officer, frustrated by Kennedy's relentless questioning, snapped. In a moment that would change everything, his hand shot out, landing a slap right across the senator's face. Gasps filled the courtroom. Reporters dropped their pens. Cameras zoomed in. A sitting U.S. senator had just been struck in open court, not by a protester, not by a rival politician, but by the very people sworn to protect and serve. And Kennedy? He didn't fall. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch in the way most expected. Instead, he slowly turned his head back toward the officer, the sting of the slap still visible on his reddened cheek, and the entire room held its breath. What came next would make the difference between a scandal that fizzled overnight and a moment etched forever into American political history. Kennedy leaned forward, looked the officer dead in the eye, and in that signature calm but cutting voice said, "Son, you just slapped the Constitution, and I promise you it slaps back harder." The courtroom froze. Some thought he was joking. Others thought he was about to order the officer's arrest. But Kennedy wasn't done. He reached into a stack of documents, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said, waving it lightly, "is the oath you swore to uphold. You don't get to put your hand on me or any American citizen just because you don't like the truth. The law doesn't bend to your temper. It breaks you when you try." That line was a spark. Phones started recording. Clips began circulating online within minutes. #Slapgate was trending before Kennedy even finished speaking. And here's where the flip happened. Kennedy didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for revenge. Instead, he turned the officer's violent outburst into the sharpest lesson in accountability anyone in that room had ever seen. What was supposed to humiliate him instead gave him the high ground, and he grabbed it with both hands. The officer's slap, intended as a show of dominance, instantly became the ultimate backfire. By staying calm, by leaning into his wit, Kennedy transformed himself from a victim of assault into the symbol of restraint and justice. The audience erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Even those who disagreed with Kennedy politically couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. A senator had been struck in public. And instead of crumbling, he turned the moment into a speech that hit harder than any hand could. What no one realized then was that this was only the beginning. That one slap would unravel deeper truths, hidden corruption, and unexpected twists that even Kennedy himself couldn't have predicted. And the world? It was watching. The slap had landed. The cameras had caught it. The courtroom was buzzing like a beehive struck with a stick. But John Kennedy wasn't done. He was just getting started. In that silent pause after his cutting remark, "Son, you just slapped the Constitution. And I promise you, it slaps back harder." The officer stood stiff, unsure whether to apologize or double down. The judge pounded the gavel, calling for order. But Kennedy raised his hand gently, signaling he didn't need the judge's protection. "Your Honor," Kennedy drawled, "if it's all right with you, I'd like to let this young man dig his own grave." That line set the tone. The crowd leaned forward. This wasn't going to be a legal hearing anymore. This was turning into a battle of principle, and Kennedy was about to turn the courtroom into a stage. He looked back at the officer, his voice calm but piercing. "You're wearing a badge. That badge isn't a license to slap a man when you feel like it. It's a reminder you work for the people. And right now, every camera in this room is showing the people exactly who you are." The officer, flustered, muttered something about Kennedy provoking him. That was all Kennedy needed. He pounced. "Provoking you?" Kennedy shot back, eyebrows raised. "Asking questions is my job. Answering them is yours. If my words scare you more than your own actions, maybe the badge doesn't fit." The courtroom gasped again. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. Tweets fired off in real time. Kennedy destroys officer in live court hearing. Clips of the exchange began hitting social feeds before the officer could even compose himself. Then Kennedy did something unexpected. Instead of pressing the attack, he pulled back, just enough to flip the whole atmosphere. He turned to the audience, the judge, even the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this isn't about me. This isn't about one officer. This is about trust. Every citizen should feel safe when they see a uniform, not worried about catching a slap for asking the wrong question. If it can happen to me, a sitting U.S. senator, what chance does the average man have?" The words hit like a hammer. Suddenly, the slap wasn't just an assault on Kennedy. It symbolized every abuse of power that ordinary Americans feared but rarely saw so clearly. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Kennedy wasn't looking at him anymore. He was talking past him, to the entire nation watching. That's when Kennedy leaned in again, lowering his voice so the room had to go silent just to hear him. "You see, the real power in this country doesn't come from a slap, a shove, or a show of force. It comes from the truth. And the truth, gentlemen, is that no one, no matter the badge, the office, or the title, is above the law." Applause broke out. Quiet first, then louder, despite the judge's gavel. It wasn't just Kennedy's supporters clapping. Even critics, even skeptics in the room, couldn't deny the strength of that moment. The flip was complete. In less than 5 minutes, Kennedy had turned himself from a slapped senator into the defender of the Constitution, while the officer shrank into the symbol of unchecked authority. But the story didn't end there, because what Kennedy did next, the evidence he pulled out, the names he exposed, the truth he forced into the open, would shake the foundations of more than just one courtroom. What began with a slap was about to unravel a chain of corruption nobody saw coming. And Kennedy? He was ready to set the match to it all. The room was already buzzing, but Senator John Kennedy wasn't finished. He'd turned the courtroom into his arena, but now he was about to drop something bigger, a revelation that no one saw coming. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick folder bound in red. The cameras zoomed in. The officer who had slapped him stiffened in his chair. Kennedy placed the folder gently on the table in front of him, tapping it twice with his finger. "Your Honor," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the tension, "I came here today prepared, not just to answer questions, but to ask them. And I think it's high time this court takes a hard look at the truth behind this whole case." The judge adjusted his glasses, curious. The officer swallowed hard. Reporters leaned forward like lions waiting to pounce on prey. Kennedy opened the folder and pulled out the first sheet. It wasn't just a document. It was a record, a police misconduct report. "This officer right here," Kennedy said, holding it up for the cameras, "has been reported 3 times for excessive force. Not once, not twice, 3 times. And yet, somehow, he's still here today, sitting in uniform, slapping senators in open court." Gasps echoed. The officer's lawyer objected furiously, but Kennedy held up his hand like a traffic cop. "Oh, don't worry, counselor," he smirked. "There's plenty more where that came from." Page after page came out of that folder. Emails, body cam transcripts, complaints that had been buried under bureaucratic red tape. Kennedy laid them on the table, like a gambler showing his cards. Only this time, the hand wasn't just strong, it was devastating. The judge finally spoke, leaning forward. "Senator Kennedy, are you saying the department deliberately ignored these reports?" Kennedy's eyes narrowed. "Your Honor, I'm saying this officer's slap was not an accident. It was a symptom of a system that protects its own while ordinary people pay the price." The courtroom went still. Kennedy turned his gaze directly to the officer, who now looked less like an enforcer of the law and more like a man exposed. "You thought you could silence me with a slap?" Kennedy said quietly. "But what you really did was open the door for me to show America what happens when power is unchecked. And son, once that door is open, it doesn't shut. Social media exploded. Clips of Kennedy pulling out the folder were already trending. Hashtags like hashtag Kennedy versus cops and hashtag truth in court flashed across millions of feeds. Even people who normally tuned out politics were glued to their phones. They weren't just watching a senator. They were watching a man dismantle a system brick by brick. The officer tried to interject, stammering about taken out of context. But Kennedy wasn't letting go. Context, he thundered. Context is when a hard-working American is pulled over for a broken taillight and ends up face down on the pavement. Context is when body cam footage mysteriously disappears. Context is when men like you keep your jobs because the paperwork gets lost. That's the context, officer. The courtroom broke into murmurs, some in disbelief, some in applause. The judge had to bang the gavel again just to restore order, but the damage was already done. Kennedy had flipped the narrative entirely. What had begun as an embarrassing slap was now turning into a national scandal. And he wasn't finished yet, because the last page in that folder, sealed in an envelope, wasn't just about misconduct. It was about money. Big money. Kennedy leaned back, slid the sealed envelope across the table, and said with sly grin, "And when America sees what's in here, well, let's just say the slap will be the least of this officer's problems." The court had gone from laughter to silence to shock. And now it was bracing for an explosion. The courtroom was holding its breath. That sealed envelope Kennedy slid across the table wasn't just paper. It was dynamite. Everyone could feel it. The judge stared at it. The reporters aimed their cameras at it. And the officer's attorney looked like he just swallowed fire. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a sly grin tugging at his lips. "You see, Your Honor, slaps are loud. But corruption? Corruption whispers. And sometimes, if you're lucky enough, you catch it on paper before it gets shredded." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly is in this envelope, Senator?" Kennedy tapped the envelope twice, just like he'd done with the folder earlier. "Proof," he said slowly. "Proof that this officer, and maybe more than just this officer, wasn't just ignoring the law. He was profiting from breaking it." The crowd gasped. The officer's jaw tightened. His attorney jumped to his feet, shouting, "Objection! This is outrageous, Your Honor." But the judge held up his hand. "Sit down, counselor. I want to see where this is going." Kennedy opened the envelope, pulled out a stack of documents, and spread them across the table. "Bank transfers," he announced. "Shell companies. Payments funneled through third-party accounts. And wouldn't you know it, every transaction just happens to line up with cases this officer handled." He flipped one sheet toward the judge. "Here's a payment. Here's the date. And here's the case where charges suddenly disappeared. Another sheet. Here's a deposit. And here's the incident report that mysteriously went missing the next day." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture every page, fingers flying across keyboards. The officer's face was pale now, his confidence gone. Kennedy's voice grew sharper. This slap wasn't just personal. It was professional. It was a desperate attempt to silence someone who finally had the receipts. "And let me tell you, Your Honor, America doesn't like receipts. They love them." The judge examined the papers carefully, his expression darkening. "Are you telling me, Senator, that this officer has been on someone's payroll?" Kennedy didn't blink. "I'm telling you, Your Honor, this slap was bought and paid for. And if you follow the money far enough, you won't just find one officer. You'll find a network." The crowd gasped again. A network? Suddenly, this wasn't just about one slap or one bad cop. It was about something bigger, systemic, orchestrated, and hidden in plain sight. The officer tried to speak, but his words stumbled out. That's not true. This is fabricated." Kennedy slammed his hand on the table. "Fabricated? Son, if this is fabricated, then the bank better explain why their stamps are on every one of these pages. If this is fabricated, then the people whose names are attached to these accounts better come in here and swear under oath. You want to talk about lies? Let's do it under the penalty of perjury." The silence after that was heavy. Everyone knew Kennedy wasn't bluffing. He never brought half-truths to a fight. Only weapons forged in cold, hard fact. On Twitter, hashtags like hashtag Kennedy exposes corruption and hashtag follow the money were already trending. TikTok clips of him slamming the table racked up millions of views in minutes. The slap that was supposed to humiliate him had now become a national rallying cry. And Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the judge. "Your Honor, I ask that this evidence be entered into the record, and I also request a full federal investigation, not just into this officer, but into everyone tied to these accounts. Because when the American people see this, they're going to demand accountability, and I don't intend to leave this courtroom until they get it." The judge slowly nodded. "So ordered." The officer collapsed back in his chair, defeated. The courtroom broke into chaos. Reporters shouting, people cheering, guards trying to restore order. And Kennedy? He just sat there calmly, the man who had flipped the entire scenario in less than an hour. But deep down, everyone knew. This was only the beginning to be by the time Kennedy left the courthouse that evening, the world outside had already changed. Reporters swarmed the steps like a flood, microphones outstretched, cameras flashing, questions being hurled from every direction. "Senator, what did you just reveal? Do you really think this goes all the way up the chain? Are you accusing the entire department of corruption?" Kennedy didn't answer right away. He adjusted his tie, gave that half smirk that always made his critics nervous, and simply said, "Follow the money. That's all I'll say tonight. The rest will come out soon enough." And with that, he disappeared into the black sedan waiting at the curb. But outside the courthouse wasn't where the real storm was brewing. It was online. Within hours, Kennedy's fiery words and the images of those bank records spread across every major platform. Twitter threads unraveled the evidence, connecting dots between names and cases. TikTok edits layered dramatic music over Kennedy slamming the table, turning the courtroom moment into a viral meme. YouTube live streams replayed his speech on a loop, with headlines screaming, "Kennedy drops bombshell in court in slap backfires, corruption exposed." Cable news networks scrambled to keep up. CNN ran a segment titled "The Slap Heard Around the Country." Fox News labeled it "Kennedy's Coup in Court." MSNBC framed it as the reckoning for law enforcement accountability. Across the political spectrum, one thing was clear. Kennedy had struck a nerve that nobody could ignore. In living rooms across America, families who barely followed politics were suddenly glued to their TVs. Parents explained to their kids why corruption mattered, while teenagers scrolled through Kennedy memes that painted him as a cowboy standing alone against a crooked system. Even late-night hosts got on the frenzy, joking. When a cop slapped Senator Kennedy, he didn't just slap a man, he slapped himself right into a federal investigation. But beyond the laughter and the memes, something deeper was happening. Kennedy's words, corruption whispers, resonated with millions who had long suspected that justice wasn't always blind. Suddenly, they had a face, a voice, and hard evidence pointing to a problem that had been buried for too long. Protesters began gathering in front of police precincts, holding signs that read, "We want answers and no more silence." Activists organized marches in major cities. Hashtags like hashtag slapbackjustice and hashtag Kennedy exposed the truth dominated trending lists for days. Inside political circles, the story hit like an earthquake. Lawmakers who had once dismissed Kennedy as a fiery sideshow were now forced to reckon with his sudden credibility. Senators received phone calls from their constituents demanding congressional hearings. Governors were pressed to review their state's police oversight boards. The Department of Justice issued a late-night statement confirming it was reviewing the materials provided by Senator Kennedy. The officer at the center of the scandal tried to lay low, but it was too late. His face was plastered across every network. His name dragged through public forums. Neighbors avoided him. Old colleagues distanced themselves. And the more he denied the charges, the more people believed Kennedy. Meanwhile, Kennedy doubled down. Appearing on a primetime interview, he leaned forward, his southern drawl calm but commanding. "This isn't about me. This isn't even about that officer. This is about whether the law served the people or whether the people serve those who abuse the law. I won't stop until every American knows the answer." And that's when the media storm transformed into something else. It wasn't just a trending story anymore. It was a movement. Across the nation, the slap had become more than an act of disrespect. It became a symbol of everything wrong with power unchecked. And Kennedy, the man who was supposed to be humiliated, had become the unlikely hero leading the charge. The slap may have happened inside a courtroom, but the consequences echoed inside the halls of power. Washington, D.C. was rattled to its core. On Capitol Hill, senators huddled in private meetings, their usual calm shaken by the wave of public outrage. Committees that had once ignored Kennedy's fiery speeches were suddenly under pressure to act. Phones rang nonstop in congressional offices, angry voters demanding answers, advocacy groups demanding reforms, journalists demanding comments. And through it all, one name kept being repeated: Senator John Kennedy. For years, Kennedy had been dismissed by some as a colorful Southern lawmaker, known for his sharp wit and blunt remarks. But now, he was no longer just a voice in the background. He was the face of a movement, a senator who had turned a humiliating slap into a national reckoning. The president himself couldn't avoid the storm. During a press briefing, a reporter asked point blank, "Mr. President, do you condemn the actions of the officer who struck Senator Kennedy? And what do you say about the evidence of corruption that's now surfaced?" The president hesitated, shifting uncomfortably behind the podium. His official response was measured: "We respect the process, and we believe in accountability." But the pause before his words spoke louder than anything. It was clear even the highest office in the land was feeling the weight of Kennedy's revelation. Meanwhile, the opposition party wasted no time. Members lined up behind Kennedy, praising his courage, amplifying his evidence, and demanding congressional hearings. For them, this wasn't just about corruption. It was a chance to ride the wave of public anger and put pressure on the administration. But it wasn't only Kennedy's political allies who were paying attention. Even some of his fiercest critics began softening their tone. A liberal senator who had often clashed with him on policy admitted in an interview, "We don't always agree with Senator Kennedy, but we can't deny he's exposing something serious here. We need to look at this carefully." The hearings came quickly. Within 2 weeks, the Senate Judiciary Committee announced it would open a full investigation into the officer's conduct and the broader claims of systemic corruption. The announcement alone sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Inside the committee room, Kennedy sat tall, papers in front of him, his expression calm but unyielding. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was steering the conversation. Each witness that came forward seemed to reinforce his claims. Whistleblowers, retired officers, even clerks who had processed questionable cases. Piece by piece, the puzzle Kennedy hinted at in the courtroom was being laid bare. Outside the hearings, protests swelled. Crowds marched on Washington, waving signs that read "Justice for all" and "An old man above the law." Chants echoed across the National Mall, captured by drones and live-streamed across social media. Kennedy, for his part, didn't indulge in victory laps. His speeches were measured, his tone serious. "This isn't about left or right," he told the cameras. "This is about right and wrong. If we let this go, we tell every citizen that power can crush truth. I won't stand for that." But while the public saw a determined lawmaker, behind the scenes of pressure on Kennedy was immense. Powerful figures who stood to lose from his revelations began moving against him. Political consultants whispered of smear campaigns. Anonymous threats began arriving at his office. A few allies even warned him privately, "John, you've stirred something bigger than you realize. Be careful." Still, Kennedy didn't back down. If anything, the pushback only steeled his resolve. The slap, once meant to humiliate him, had turned into a rallying cry. And now, Kennedy wasn't just defending himself. He was fighting to change the system. In the Senate halls, in the media, and in the streets, the political fallout was clear. A new chapter had begun, and Kennedy was at the center of it. The courtroom slap had set everything in motion. The hearings had turned whispers into headlines. But what happened next would cement Senator John Kennedy's place in political history. It was the final day of the Senate Judiciary Committee's hearings. The nation was glued to their screens. Cable news ran split screen, showing Kennedy seated in the chamber, reporters buzzing outside, and crowds chanting in the streets. It felt less like a hearing and more like a trial for the soul of the justice system. Kennedy's evidence had already painted a damning picture of corruption. He had shown records of cases altered under pressure, police officers shielding one another from accountability, and even money funneled quietly into special accounts that didn't appear on official budgets. But it was the last piece of evidence, one he had deliberately held back. That would change everything. When it was his turn to speak, Kennedy rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. He looked directly into the cameras, as if speaking not just to the senators before him, but to every American watching at home. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but sharp, "for weeks now, we've asked how deep this corruption goes. Today, I'll give you the answer. The officer who struck me wasn't acting alone. He was carrying out orders." The room went silent. Papers stopped shuffling. Every senator leaned forward. Kennedy held up a single folder. Inside were communications, emails, memos, and directives, linking not just local officers, but high-ranking officials within the Department of Justice to a coordinated effort to bury misconduct cases. The slap had been personal, yes, but the corruption it symbolized was systemic, stretching far beyond one man in uniform. Gasps rippled across the chamber as the documents were displayed. Reporters outside scrambled to break the news. Kennedy drops final bomb. Doge tied to cover UPS. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He leaned closer to the microphone. "Now, I know what some of you are thinking," he said, his drawl unmistakable. "How could a senator from Louisiana find himself in the crosshairs of conspiracy this large?" Well, friends, it's simple. I asked the wrong questions. And when you ask the wrong questions in Washington, you find out real quick who wants to keep the answers buried. The chamber erupted, not in applause, but in chaos. Some senators demanded immediate resignations. Others tried desperately to change the subject. Cameras flashed as Kennedy calmly closed his folder, sat back down, and folded his hands. That night, the country split into two camps: those who praised Kennedy as a whistleblower for the ages, and those who accused him of grandstanding for political gain. But no matter the opinion, one fact was undeniable. He had forced the nation to confront something it couldn't ignore. The fallout was immediate. The Justice Department announced a special counsel to investigate. Several high-ranking officials stepped down, pending review. The officer who had slapped Kennedy was no longer just suspended. He was charged with misconduct and obstruction. And Kennedy? He became a symbol. Protesters held up posters with his face beside the words. One man stood up. Editorials declared the hearings the most consequential political moment in years. But behind closed doors, Kennedy didn't gloat. He told his closest staff, "This isn't my victory. It's the people's. If one senator can be slapped for asking questions, what chance does an ordinary citizen have? This fight isn't about me. It's about all of us." The final twist wasn't just the evidence or the resignations or the hearings. It was the transformation of the story itself. What began as a shocking moment of humiliation had ended as a movement. And in the quiet after the storm, one truth remained clear. The slap meant to silence John Kennedy had given him the loudest voice in the country.